Hi, so good morning, and thank you so much for being here and agreeing to talk with me today. So, could we start by just having you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Shira Berkowitz. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm the Senior Director of Public Policy for PROMO, which is Missouri's statewide LGBTQ plus policy and advocacy organization.
Great, thank you. So, just to start, could you tell us a little bit about the work that Promo does and also just some background on how you came to be in your position?
Absolutely. PROMO has been around for just over 35 years. We're an organization that was founded to protect the privacy rights of Missourians and evolved over the years to narrow in quite a bit more and protect the privacy rights and bodily autonomy for all LGBTQ plus people. And today that looks like making sure that LGBTQ plus Missourians feel a sense of liberation and lived experience that matches an equitable experience in line with all other Missourians. And we do that through public policy change and grassroots organizing and building statewide visible out leaders.
Great. So, just a little background on myself. I actually grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, and also went to law school at St. Louis University. And I reached out to you and to Promo specifically because I actually was a Promo volunteer in high school. I stuffed a lot of envelopes because that's what people did back then in the dark ages before the internet. But I also participated in a lobby day in Jefferson City. And, I did a lot of sort of activisty things in high school. But, that experience, that lobby day at Promo was one of the experiences that really like drove me to go to law school and pursue law as a career because it did really imprint on me how important the law and legislation is on people's lives and protecting people's rights. Um, Growing up in Missouri, even though I knew it was maybe more conservative than my own family, I didn't perceive it as an incredibly conservative or kind of politically um, right centered state. So I was actually very surprised and disheartened to, see in the news the type of legislation, the type of anti-trans legislation that had been enacted in Missouri. Obviously, Missouri is just one state where this is happening, but I think Missouri kind of can serve as a microcosm of what is happening nationally with what, I feel is fair to call a coordinated attack on the trans community, including trans kids. And I'd be interested to get your perspective and a little bit more background on how this is all played out in Missouri. Kind of when did it start appearing in the state legislature and when did it really start taking hold and making progress?
Yeah, for sure. I would say about 9 years ago, we, not just in Missouri, but nationally, saw some of our very first legislation that looked like bathroom bills, keeping folks who are transgender or non binary out of using the restroom that maybe does or doesn't correlate to the gender marker on their birth certificate, but um, instilling that they could only use the restroom if it did. And that type of legislation really peaked with a bill passing in North Carolina, but Missouri had been fighting one very similar for 3 or 4 years, just as aggressively. And there seemed to be a moment where uh, the LGBTQ advocacy, I guess, climate like won that argument, or created enough of an alignment with the majority of people that there isn't really an issue with anyone using a restroom, and that type of legislation petered out. But with passing uh, the same sex marriage equality nationwide, we saw an aggressive uptick in anti-LGBTQ legislation immediately following, which went back towards some of that that bathroom ban legislation to very specifically attack the transgender population of people. Um, it seems to be like the more narrow the legislation attack is, and the more our opposition can create this picture that transgender people are so vastly different from anyone else. That types of legislation, the anti-legislation gets legs, and we've seen it in the past 3 years, really heavily attacking transgender youth, is this way or this argument to say that transgender youth do not know who they are. Their adults know better, and or just legislators, elected officials in general, know better about who they are. And it's been a really challenging issue to get ahead of, on the side of, humanizing transgender youth and making it more widely known and familiar that transgender youth are no different than any other um, peer of theirs. But because of that wedge that was driven into the unfamiliarity of who transgender people are, and the court cases that have drawn this legislation up into a more prominent space or priority or need to legislate away the rights of youth and their parents who don't know what's best for them, or under that guise that don't know what's best for them. um, we've been losing the argument, and in a state like Missouri, we had two bills passed this year that take away the rights of a lot of transgender youth, and will go into effect pending any kind of court blockage August 28th. And we're in community with many, many other red states, very specifically Texas and Oklahoma, and Florida, who are, as a state, losing the rights for transgender youth and their families to support them.
Yeah, so I'd like to talk a little bit more about like what you have observed in the enactment of those two specific pieces of legislation, which you're referring to the bans on gender affirming care, but also the bans on athletic participation. So, what have you observed the strategy of the proponents of this legislation to be, right? Like, how have they garnered support for their position? How have they messaged it to the public? Because for me, it's hard to imagine how you sell discrimination and how you sell the exclusion of kids, right? Yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that it's been a 40-year, very slow and intentional um, opposition creep that has been able to create the argument around who transgender people are without transgender individuals being able to set the tone and the narrative for themselves. So, like, what we're fighting against in these past 3 years is years in the making of our opposition claiming that transgender people are unwell. They have mental health issues. They don't know who they are or what's best for them, and therefore there needs to be laws to make sure that, however they seem to thrive as adults, isn't due to irreversible changes. And I think there's just a fear around it. It's a religious argument. It's a fear around, like, this is not how our God made you, or you should be. And that has been a drive nationally over the past, like, century, but even more, of prioritizing the religious voice over one specific religious voice over any other voices or experiences. So I think that's like the foundation that we're playing against. And um, we go back to the bathroom bills, the bathroom bans, when we talk about why we're losing our rights in being able to participate in sports. And it's one, that narrative that locker rooms are not safe, that if you have more than one gender in any locker room, that there's going to be abuse or harassment that is cultivated because of that permissiveness, which is simply untrue. But there's that unknown of like, could that be happening in my school with my kid? Well, we don't want that. So there's that argument that we never quite let slip away. And then it goes like, it's right in sync, this oppositional argument with the equality that we fight for in women's sports, which is not, it does not have such a deep history beyond gaining that equality. And we're still fighting for so many equalities just in women's sports to separate from men's competition. So the argument that there are only two genders, that there is men's sports and there's women's sports, and you have to choose one and you have to play on one based off of how you're assigned at birth, um, is threatening, or it feels threatening to cisgendered women who have fought so hard for their own space to play in their own competition, and for families who have fought for that space for their daughters. And it comes at, like, truly there's just misalignment or misunderstanding of what it means to be transgender, because a transgender woman is a woman and a transgender man is a man. And by not believing that, or not believing people who know intrinsically who they are, we're creating a division even further in the idea of what is equality in sports. So, like, we do have two different sets of bills, and I would argue that the transgender healthcare bans are a bit more dangerous than whether or not transgender youth can play sports. Um, and so our focus as an organization had been so, like, highly prioritizing making sure that everyone has access to healthcare. And I wouldn't say that it slipped through the cracks at all. I would say that we fought, and um, the negotiation at the end of the argument was that if a sports ban is going to have to pass, and politicians could not agree on the reasoning of why this is necessary legislation, that we needed to put a sunset on any type of legislation that passed under that vein of, like, we don't know what the real problem is, but we need to do something about it. Didn't fly for our organization, doesn't fly for any LGBTQ rights organization. So we do have this really incredibly egregious sports ban that bans transgender youth from the time they are 5 years old all the way up through their college careers from being able to participate in sports. And the silver lining is that it will be sunset in 4 years. Not that our legislature might not go, well, like, they could easily go back and, like, make it worse or remove that sunset, or say, like, we found the solution to this problem and it's this bill, so transgender athletes can never play sports. But for right now, we have 4 years to fight to get it to completely go away and not be a
Right.
part of
And, hopefully, it will be moot because of the Department of Education's, proposed rule changes to Title IX, at least in the majority of cases where the entity is a recipient of Title IX funds. And that is one of the important accomplishments of this rulemaking, if it becomes final, is that it will sort of squash these blanket bans at the state level. But I don't think, right, that it completely negates the harm, right? So I'm curious
totally.
what impact you have seen on the trans community specifically, or in particular trans youth, with sort of the introduction of this legislation, the consideration, and then ultimately the passage of it. What is the message, and how has it been received?
Well, the message is that we don't believe you are who you are. We don't believe that you know who you are. So there's a real devaluing that comes with passing any of this legislation, or even talking about this legislation prior to it passing or stopping it. Just the rhetoric in the community in social media, on the internet that's accessible to all age kids because everyone has access to
Mhm.
screens and technology, um, is a real attack on their sense of self and their self worth. Um, because this legislation hasn't necessarily gone into effect yet, but it will ahead of this school year. I know we've seen families leaving the state, looking elsewhere if their kids are currently participating in school-based athletics. And I think the real people that this hurts the most are non-binary or gender fluid individuals who aren't quite sure how they're going to be perceived continuing to play on their school team. Um, uh, like caveat, especially also transgender youth who are transgender boys or girls, but everyone that falls in that in between doesn't really have a place, even if they were choosing a space in that binary before. Now they're even more ostracized from even feeling that they could try out for a team or could play with their peers. And then like our youngest kid, like elementary school kids, play co-ed all the time or play intramural teams where gender doesn't even make a difference. But this is already sending the message to children very, very early on that they don't have a place and they're not seen. Um, I think that the impact will also put a real division in the transgender community that's always been there, whether or not somebody is stealth in their identity or passes quote unquote as a boy or a girl, will give them a safety net or some permissiveness to continue playing under the secret, that don't ask don't tell secret of like, well, if nobody knows, you're fine, but everybody else outside of that is not. And that's a really slippery slope argument in our own community of who has access to healthcare and
Mhm.
who doesn't. Um, and then, like ultimately, this just like puts a huge stain on our state. Like we're talking about college athletics, and our largest school's team is in the SEC, and so whether they have transgender athletes on their team or not, this is going to say you can't be a part of any of our teams whether we knew you're there or not. And we can't play against a school who allows transgender athletes to play on their team. So it's going to economically really impact not only like who goes to play or watch sports, but who wants to apply to play sports at a college in a state like Missouri that is not inclusive. So I think the future impacts are going to be incredibly detrimental for our entire state, or as like the very short-sighted effects are detrimental to who feels they can still stay as a family and grow up in our state.
Yeah, it's hard to see as somebody who grew up in St. Louis and who, you know, I always remembered it and describe it to people as a good place for families. And, it unfortunately seems to be becoming a place that is not. So I'm curious too whether you have, as an activist, whether you've experienced challenges, mobilizing the LGBTQ plus community to oppose legislation related to sports, in contrast to other types of anti LGBTQ plus legislation, like bans on gender affirming care.
100%. It's I would not say that it's like easy to mobilize anyone around anti-trans legislation who isn't directly impacted. But the idea of, can our government permit or exclude healthcare for some and not others, is a universal argument. This issue piggybacking on the pandemic with vaccine mandates and school mask requirements fits really well into that argument of like, this is like, why should the government limit healthcare, or why should they have a state in what medical associations and boards and licensure providers can do or cannot do. Like, why would the state know better? Um, and when it comes to sports, I think there's a misconception that like every child is an aggressive, competitive, going to be college athlete, whereas we forget that sports are the place where young kids learn sportsmanship and how to be a teammate and how to be a leader or eye-hand coordination, like all of the very simple, basic, like very necessary community skills we gain are not about winning or losing. They're just about being a part of a community or being a part of a group of individuals. Um, and so, like, therefore, it's not really an easy argument to mobilize around. I'd say the same goes for we haven't figured out as a movement the messaging that resonates with people that is inclusive or encompassing of yes and women's sports and yes and equality in women's sports. And because of that, we lose a whole lot of individuals who are very like, oh, absolutely pro trans rights and believe in the existence and the humanity of trans people. But when it encroaches on the equality in what they've fought for so long, we lose them along that way. So, as an activist and in this space, we rely very heavily on Athlete Ally, which is an incredible national, global organization that fights for equality amongst sports, morals, ethics, human rights, anywhere that major competitions are, to put us in connection with ally athletes. So we've had Lori Lindsay is one of the largest proponents and most visible activists who've joined us in Missouri to fight this legislation as a pro female athlete. And as somebody who's still on the front lines of that equality work, to try to give her voice to this conversation as a non-issue. We've had Pam Botner as well join us, who like created equality in her sport of canoeing in Olympic spaces by there was only one category, one men's category, and women could participate in it. And it's like, so that was technically all gender, and we can look at the top athletic sports in all different varieties of combinations of gender competition, still a non-issue. And then I think that when any threat to how you live your life permits itself to like grow in your purview. So like our trans athletes are very invisible. They don't want to be on the front lines of this because they want to continue playing their sport. They want to be a middle schooler or a high schooler and run cross country or play baseball without being scrutinized for whatever gender they were assigned at birth. And so we don't have a really large like, comrade of individuals coming together to fight against the right to participate in sports for transgender individuals. And we don't have a youth voice around it. Not just in our state, I think in many, many states. We're lucky that we have professional athlete voice around it. But in order to thrive and keep your childhood, it's too dangerous to speak out or to say that you're might not be exactly who you are to all of your peers and all of your coaches and etc. So it's an incredibly like multi-level issue to organize around and to speak out against and to find it so like important and crucial and pivotal of a conversation. And all of that is always going on in the background of these healthcare bans are also accelerating very, very fast through legislatures. And there's almost this like, well, what's more dangerous? What's going to lose more lives? What is going to what like where do we have to give up our fight if our voice is smaller? And that it's like such an incorrect platter to be dealt. This is just as quality of life, whether or not there's access to sports or activities that there is
Right.
also to
Well, and
healthcare.
fundamentally, the trans community shouldn't have to choose. Yeah.
Yes, also that.
So I think that actually is a really good segue to, what you think it's important to communicate to allies of the trans community who might not see inclusion in sports as a high stakes issue, right? That like, what do you think? I mean, you did touch on this a little bit, but if you kind of had to sum it up, what does sports mean for trans youth, and what does inclusion in sports mean?
I mean, I think in summary, sports are no different than any other piece of life that you want to pull out from. It's whether or not anybody has access to everything else. So that exclusionary idea of like, yeah, you can go to school and we believe you that you're a boy, or we believe you that you're a girl, but you can only go to school up until the time when there's activities afterwards or beforehand. It's a very it's too exclusionary. It's carving out a space where trans youth cannot belong, and that idea of how then do trans youths spend their school day with emotional and mental wellness, knowing that they can only participate in school up to a point. Like, how do we care for them? And it's an egregious idea that we would exclude anyone from any part of their childhood day.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me, and hopefully, I'm going to, include links to Promo's website and legislative actions in the show notes, and hopefully, this will encourage other people to get involved and pay attention to these issues at the state level. I think it's incredibly important.
I
Thank
appreciate
you.
that a lot. Thank you, and thanks for having me here.